So non-government standards bodies play a key role in the government's collaboration, the DoD's collaboration with industry and our partners in the private sector. And to lead our next panel with leaders from non-government standards bodies, I'd like to welcome Tim Kazansky.
Good morning. I'd like to call the panel up to the stage. Can you all hear me? Sounds like you can. As already stated, my name is Tim Kazansky, and I'm a member of the Defense Standardization Program Office. This morning's panel will focus on some of the public-private partnerships that support advancing standardization in a digital world. As our world becomes a more complex space, these public-private partnerships will be paramount in maintaining the interoperability we have with our SDOs, NGOs, and industry. By working together, we will be able to generate solutions which will ensure we have the tools to win the fight. This morning's discussion will delve into those partnerships, starting with ANSI, and highlighting some of the work that they are pursuing with NATO and through their collaboratives. Then shifting perspectives, we will hear from AIA and their work with the international community and ISO, as well as their efforts developing the NAS 3D library. Finally, we'll finish with an SAE discussion, picking up on the digital theme, on their efforts in working with the broader standardization community on digitizing standards. First, I'd like to kick things off and introduce Ms. Mary Saunders, who serves as Senior Vice President for Government Relations and Public Policy at ANSI. Ms. Saunders leads ANSI's efforts to advocate for greater use of voluntary consensus standards and conformance programs by government agencies and broad participation by agency personnel in standards development. Prior to joining ANSI, Ms. Saunders had a long government career, which included working with a broad range of foreign government officials on U.S. regulatory and standards-related matters. Would you please welcome Ms. Mary Saunders to the podium?
Thanks, Tim. Appreciate it. And good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here. So you're a hard act to follow, so we'll see how I do. I'm going to take you into the broader standards world, which isn't necessarily quite as exciting as the digital standards world, but we'll get there. But before I get started, can I just see a show of hands of how many folks in the audience have participated in a standards activity? Could be formal, consensus, consortia. Okay, so you're a knowledgeable audience. So let me start from there and go to the. Oh, I can do this. Yes, it's a question of managing the glasses if I need them. Pushing. Up. Upside down, I told you. So a few words about ANSI and the standard system before I get into the collaboration with NATO, the NATO Standardization Office. ANSI is not a standards developer. We're a private sector nonprofit organization. Members are the full range of the stakeholder community in standardization, and that includes government agencies. DoD is a very active participant in ANSI at all levels. We have company members. We have a large number of organizational members. About 40% of the ANSI membership is organizational members, most of whom, but not all, are standards developing organizations. And then we have university participants, members, consumers, and other range of other interests. So it's a broad range of stakeholders reflecting the broad range of interests in the standardization community. As I mentioned, ANSI itself does not develop standards. We are, however, the official U.S. representative to ISO and IEC, which are two of the major standards developing organizations at the international level. We also accredit some 240 standards developing organizations, many familiar names. That is an indicator of the rich landscape of the U.S. standardization system, as I call it. Some folks outside of the US looking in call it a chaotic system. I call it a very vibrant, flexible system with lots of different options, but there is no easy button for the US standardization system. I'm going to show this slide again at the end because I think that standards are many things, but the theme of this conference certainly is the role of standards in facilitating and enabling innovation in the classic sense and also in the more forward-leaning sense that you're talking about today. Standards aren't nothing, as I think Phil mentioned, if they're not used, if they're not accessible, they're not usable. And there's certainly great value in assessing conformity of a particular product or system to standards. That's how you validate the fact that a system actually conforms to the standards to which it was built or the standards that are relevant. So it's two pieces of the puzzle. You can't have standards unless they are actually usable. And in many cases, there needs to be some demonstration of conformity with respect to the final system. I said a few words about the US system. I mean, I grew up in the US system, working at the US Department of Commerce for most of my federal career, although I started out at DoD. Working at US Department of Commerce for most of my federal career at both the International Trade Administration and NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And so it is very clear to me, having worked with federal agencies throughout my entire career, that the US system and standards development priorities are not driven by the government. They're not driven by a central authority. They are driven by users and markets. And that's a very important, I think, value proposition that defines the US system. And we feel it makes the standards that are resulting much more valuable and usable to meet market needs and to meet other needs, including agency mission needs. The public-private partnership is a cornerstone of the US system. I started out on the public sector side of the public-private partnership and moved over to ANSI a little over 7 years ago to the private sector side. It's a very powerful partnership. The private sector actually provides most of the resources, people and money and other resources to develop standards. The government agencies are critical stakeholders, and in certain areas provide a substantial amount of resources and contributions to develop those consensus documents. So we're all about this this partnership. It's very, very important. The power of the partnership is somewhat unique to the US system. And ANSI, with respect to that partnership, is very much about the integrity of the system and its value and its contributions. So just very briefly, I'll show the 12 principles of standardization. The US system is, as I said, built on market-driven signals. And many of the standards developing organizations are domiciled in the US, but develop globally relevant standards. You've got two representatives sitting here on the panel with me. The process conforms to these very important principles for standardization that are enshrined in US law and policy, but also in the World Trade Organization. Less important probably as a set of principles generally for the defense community, but very important generally. And as you know, even in the defense space, a lot of the technologies that are used are commercial off-the-shelf technologies. They are dual-use technologies. So you're talking about standards developing organizations and users of standards that operate in both worlds or in many worlds. So these principles are very important with respect to acceptance of the resulting products in the coming out of the standardization system. And it's a global community. We see it always as a global community. There are some domestic focused activities in every economy, but particularly in the US, it's very much standardization as a global enterprise with standards developers, conformity assessment bodies, commercial and consumer acceptance, and government acceptance as well, where relevant, either as specifications or in a regulatory context. So I want to now move into some brief comments about our interactions, ANSI's interactions with the NATO Standardization Office. And I thank Tasha Beckman for making that introduction, and Tasha and Michael and the former head of the Defense Standardization Program Office, Greg Saunders, who has no relationship, for starting this whole process of broadening the aperture with respect to the standards that NATO looks to meet needs. So I'm sure you're all aware, so I won't spend a huge amount of time on NATO's strategy on emerging and disruptive technologies, which dates formally to February of 2021. There's a close similarity with the broader US government concentration on standardization initiatives into critical and emerging technologies, but in the NATO context, these are emerging and disruptive technologies to the defense enterprise. So NATO relatively early recognized the role and importance of disruptive technologies and the fact that the need to respond to the impact of those technologies are key to ensuring that NATO retains strategic and effective dominance. And these are the technology priorities that I pulled from the formal strategy. You'll see if you've looked at the OSTP's list of critical and emerging technologies, which is quite comprehensive, or the shorter list in the US government National Standard Strategy for Critical and Emerging Technology, you will see a lot of consistency here. And I will note that in each of these areas, I think each of them, there are multiple standards venues that are looking at where users and practitioners are looking at the implementation of standards or the development of standards in each of these areas. I can name, ISO and IEC are looking at most of these areas in one way or another, either jointly in Joint Technical Committee 1 or individually in specific technical committees in ISO and IEC, but certainly SAE, IEEE, AIA, et cetera, are looking at 3GPP and next generation communications networks. There are a lot of constituencies here that are looking at standards. And I think it's important to note in terms of the technology priorities, depending on your technology area, standards may be leading indicators. So standards foreshadow technology commercialization and development, or they're lagging, which the technology is very early in the market and standards come a little later in the process. So I think important to keep that in mind. NATO's definition of a standard is consistent with the ISO definition of a standard, the WTO definition, and the definition in US policy. So it is a classic definition. Doesn't say anything about digital or any of those other attributes you've been talking about today, but I just note it because it is a broader definition than I think that allows you to look at more than one standards developing organization, more than one solution provider. So, and I want to make this point very clearly if it hasn't come through earlier in my comments, that there are many pathways to globally relevant standards. I dealt a lot in my e-commerce department career and still do to some extent at ANSI with foreign governments, trying to explain to them the US regulatory system and the US standard system. And in many other countries, there's a much simpler definition of what are relevant standards for government use, and that's ISO and IEC and ITU. But there are many different models, and I want to note the national participation model, which includes ISO and IEC, and ANSI as the national standards body. ITU and Codex are treaty organizations where some activity that is relevant takes place. Direct participation is a very important aspect of the standards space. SAE is listed, AIA the same, ASME, ASTM, and others. Technical experts from around the globe come to the table and develop solutions, which are then presented to the market. And then very important in the digital space are consortia, fora, and de facto participation. So that's, we can't leave those aside. I think Bill mentioned Object Management Group, but there's OASIS and there are Open Geospatial Consortium and others, very important roles in the standards space in the defense area as well as more broadly. So as I said, Tasha was kind enough to make connections for ANSI with key NATO contacts on standards. Our interactions have mostly been with the Standardization Office, but I just wanted to list that hierarchy for you. And DoD, DSPO has also made connections with the NATO Standardization Office for ASTM, SAE, and other individual standards developers. So it's been a really good joint effort. So our interactions from the ANSI perspective, in part because of our role in managing the US Secretariat to ISO IEC JTC1, which is all about information technology, where IT, AI, data security, quantum, and a lot of other areas on that disruptive technology lists where foundational standards are being written. So we've provided multiple briefings on the standards landscape in several of the NATO priority areas. We've on an ongoing basis, NSO has asked us to list possible sources of global standards to meet NATO needs, and we've been happy to do that, representing all of our organizational members and those outside of the ANSI membership. And we've also provided a couple of briefings to the NATO Committee for Standardization on at use of civil standards workshops. And I will say there's, as Tim mentioned, there's been a particular interest in the ANSI collaboratives. So I just want to talk briefly about, I think just one, maybe two of the ANSI collaboratives. ANSI collaboratives have been in existence for about 20 years, and it's a national priority technology area where a federal agency or multiple agencies or other stakeholders come to ANSI and ask us to generate a broad range of stakeholder discussions to identify what's out there in the standards landscape what's missing and what are the priority gaps to be addressed, and then stakeholders go out and address those gaps. So one example is the Additive Manufacturing Standards Collaborative, which I note because it's very important for DoD in terms of repair and maintenance of equipment, and also it is was begun in collaboration with one of the early manufacturing institutes that was funded by DoD, America Makes. That activity continues. We update the roadmap periodically. I just note the deliverables. It started 7 years ago, just about when I joined ANSI, identifying gaps with lots of work has been done on gaps, particularly at ASTM and in other areas. And so we've published progress reports. The most recent one is in April of 2021. And that's a roadmap, which I know folks like at Boeing and other corporations have found very valuable to address or influence their own strategies. And then the Uncrewed Aircraft Systems Standardization Collaborative, the UASSC. This launched in September of 2017 at the direction of the FAA, primarily to look at the standards needed for safe integration of UAS into the national airspace. But as you know, there's quite a broad use of drones in the military space as well. And so DoD, DOJ, DHS, and others have been active members of this collaborative. Same approach that this presentation was, a presentation on that collaborative was given to the NATO Use of Civil Standards workshop, showing exactly how vibrant that standards landscape is as well. And then I said I would get back to this slide because we're really about building in this context for you all in this workshop, building blocks of innovation. Standards are very important for health, safety, environment, and all kinds of other aspects. But here, I think you're focusing on helping speed technology commercialization, helping to create efficiencies, facilitating interoperability, and really critically secure supply chains, which has been a significant topic of conversation at DoD and in the government space for a couple of years now. So I will stop there and turn it over to Chris or Tim.
Thank you, Mary. So next up, we've got Mr. Chris Carnahan, who serves as Assistant Vice President for Standards at the Aerospace Industries Association and leads AIA's National Aerospace Standards Program. National Aerospace Standards are industry standards that provide standard practices and part standards for the aerospace and defense industries. Mr. Carnahan oversees AIA's standards team, serving as staff liaison to AIA Standards Governance Council, and serves as committee manager for 2 international standards committees, ISO Technical Committee 20, Aircraft and Space Vehicles, and ISO Technical Committee 20, Subcommittee 16, Unmanned Aircraft Systems. I'd like to call Chris to the podium. Thank you.
All right, good morning. So Chris Carnahan. So I'm going to talk about AIA as an organization, just a quick overview. Our engagement with the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, and the importance of U.S. engagement there in a competitive global landscape. I'll give a quick overview of our standards program just so that you have some context into some of the digital standards work that we're doing with 3D parts. And then I'll briefly touch on our involvement with the Digital Standards Alliance as well. So, all right, so Aerospace Industries Association, a trade association, call ourselves the voice of the aerospace and defense industry. So we've been around for just over 100 years. We have over 300 member companies who participate. They send their experts. We function in a grouping of councils, committees, and working groups to focus on different policy areas. AIA is so covering a number of different areas, including civil aviation, space, national security. We have an international group and a team that looks at engineering and technology. The standards program supports all of these areas. As I'll mention here in a bit, we have a primary focus on a very large part standards library. But I'm going to touch on some of our ISO involvement first, and we'll get back to AIA's program in a minute. So AIA has supports 2 ISO committee secretariats. Tim mentioned TC-20 aircraft and space vehicles. We also have we support the secretariat for subcommittee 16, which is for uncrewed aircraft systems. As you can see there's a number of countries that are involved, right? So 45 member countries. So if you have any background in ISO standards, it's member countries that participate. And Mary just talked about how there's a lot of different paths to standardization, and across the globe, we have a variety of ways that governments participate in standardization. In the US, much more market-driven, private sector-led, government-supported. In other countries, very different, right? So they're much more government funding, government direction on how their experts engage. And so I'll just give a couple of quick examples off the slide here. One country in particular has keenly understood the value and power of standardization, and I don't have a specific evidence or rule book that says this is what's happening, but we can just see by some of the evidence of what's happening that there's some pretty significant incentives for, and I'll just say it, China is heavily funding their participation at ISO. So whether it's a chair position, a project leader position, and it's not just China, but just as part of my example I'll give here. So in one of our committees, the delegation came to us and said, hey, we have project leaders on these 10 projects. We'd like to appoint 10 co-project leaders. And I said, well, most of these are almost already finished. Yes, but this person has also been very, heavily engaged in the development of the standard. And so it wasn't harmful to any other country. So we went ahead and said, fine, happy to have the committee vote and add a separate co-project leader. But I think behind the scenes, there's some pretty strong incentive if you get credit for that type of engagement in the standardization process in ISO, then on the country side, there's some kind of credit that's been given for that. So just again to kind of lay the context, what are we up against on the global scene? So that's I think it's important to recognize how other countries are engaging at the ISO level. So another example. I think one of the things that we've been talking about in the U.S. government standard strategy that talks about some of the competitive environment. So, for example, talking about where we can host meetings, ISO meetings. One of the challenges for hosting in the U.S. is that at times we have not let certain participants from other countries, because of challenges with visas, to come to the U.S. and participate. At a recent plenary meeting that we hosted, we had members of one country who were planning to send 20 delegates. They only got visas for 3, right? And so, to some degree, that's a great thing. Like, hey, there's probably a reason that those people were not allowed to participate, but it also harms the U.S. participation, because the next time we want to host, then there's challenges there from the standpoint of, hey, you know what? Last time, U.S. wasn't too friendly to allow participants, and so it puts our experts at a disadvantage, because now instead of being able to periodically have a meeting in the U.S., then we're having to spend a significant amount of money for travel overseas for participation. So I realize that's there's a lot of elements to that aspect of participation, but it is certainly a challenge. So I guess what I would say, I think, and as part of the U.S. government strategy, looking at critical emerging technologies, is, making sure that we've identified where those areas are, and making sure that we're strategic as we participate in those areas. So we can't be everywhere, but we should be in the places that matter. So. quick overview of our uncrewed aircraft systems committee. As you can see from the, well, maybe you can't see, but we have a pretty broad participation, a lot of participation from the Pacific Rim countries. And our chair, the current committee chairs from the US. We did have one of our working groups that was convened by a US participant, but currently we don't have any of the working group leadership from the US. And so this continues to be a particular challenge in terms of just getting funding and participation. So, all right, so AIA's National Aerospace Standards Program. So we have National Aerospace Standards Program was started in a few years before 1941, but we published our first standard, NAS-1, which is a standard for a countersunk rivet. It's actually still in use today. So we, as I mentioned, are best known for our high-strength precision fasteners. We also have a growing list of standard practices. So when I talk about part standards, I'm talking about bolts, rivets, screws, washers, connectors, that kind of thing. So used extensively throughout the aerospace and defense industry and also outside as well. So we know that they're used in heavy machinery, that kind of thing. AIA as a standards developer, we're ANSI accredited, and our Standards Governance Council provides oversight for our activities. We'll take a look at a couple of examples very quickly. So this is, you may recognize something like this, remove before flight warning streamer. So this is based on our NAS 1756. So this was, we use this as some of our onboarding for our staff just to kind of help connect the dots between the paper document and something that you would see in the field. So. And actually, one thing I will mention is that our standard is sort of like an a la carte menu for the part numbering system. So that's one of the important elements of when you look at a table of dimensions, each one of those has a different length. And so that actually incorporates into the part numbering system, which will be important as we talk about our 3D model library. So another example, socket head cap screw, NAS 1351, which in and of itself, one of our more popular part standards, but the reason I put it up there is because I want to talk about the transition that we've made to offering 3D model library of these parts. So about 10 years ago, we were trying to look to see how can we help get our standards content one step closer to how people are actually using those standards. And so we partnered with a company that offers, actually go to the next slide here. So we partner with a company who has provided, who did all the modeling work for the part standard. So as you can see, we have a 2D drawing on the actual PDF document. But for those who have access to the 3D library, over 850 of our part standards are in there, but the part number combinations are in the millions. A lot of different varieties. It's also available in 150 different CAD formats and versions. And it's available through our distributor. So last slide here, I want to mention the Digital Standards Alliance. I'm not going to get into a lot of the details because I know that Leslie will talk about this extensively, but we're excited to be one of the charter members of the Digital Standards Alliance. It's looking at best practices around authoring and use of digital standards. So with that, I'm going to hand it over.
Thanks, Chris. Lastly, we've got Ms. Leslie McKay from SAE International. Ms. McKay has over 20 years experience leading software and hardware product development projects. Over half her career has focused on developing successful products that leverage artificial intelligence and machine learning, specifically voice recognition and natural language processing solutions. Ms. McKay joined SAE International in 2021 to drive adoption for digital standards, and here today to discuss that, please welcome Ms. Leslie McKay.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what SAE has been doing in terms of digital standards. So, I mean, everyone's talking about digital engineering. We've all been talking about it. Almost every conference that I go to, they're talking about digital engineering. These are just a few examples of slides I've seen at various conferences. I think there's something here from the digital material management. There's things here from the Air Force and so forth. Everyone is looking to, accomplish some digital initiatives. And there's a lot of reason for that, because we have quality issues that we want to overcome. We want to reduce the cost of building products. Earlier Phil was talking about getting the right things to the warfighter at the right time. One of the things I read a statistic the other day that says that it's taken the US about 16 years to get something to operational capability and out in the field, and that's compared to 7 by China. So it's huge for us to really get products to market faster. And there's a lot of statistics coming out showing that digital engineering is going to do that. It is already showing some of the promise. We need to think about integration, and we need to think about what can we do to increase efficiency. But I really wish I had this slide that showed standards from every organization. This is just SAE standards up here, but if I had ASTM standards, ASME standards, you probably wouldn't even be able to see what was behind it. But this is so important for everyone to realize. Standards touches your daily lives every day. It's there. They are touching so many parts of what you do every time you get in a car, every time you get in a plane, just so many areas where standards impact your lives, and you don't even realize it. But we need to think about, when we start thinking about digital standards, no one is building any products using SAE standards alone. Interoperability is so critical, and there are so many interrelated relationships between standards. Just yesterday, we saw a slide where it showed that web of relationships when they took from a few standards to how many standards are related to that. This is just a very simple rendering of all of those relationships and how they are today. But what do we want to do? We want to be able to pull information from each of these standards, regardless of who published it. I might want to pull requirements and track them in my tracking system. I might want to pull a test process. I might want to pull a manufacturing process. Whatever I want to pull, I want to pull that information. I want to be able to recognize that information in these PDFs and extract it into my digital system so I can either track or build or test or automate whatever I'm looking to do to get to that digital twin and to provide that digital thread. So SAE started a process a few years ago where we used natural language processing to read some of our standards and start breaking them down the PDF and start classifying various information, identifying requirements and so forth. And it was a huge effort, and it wasn't exactly successful. So this was our first attempt. We tried extracting dimensions, composition. We literally started with nuts, bolts, and metals. So we are looking to provide a system to make it easier to find standard parts, being able to search for a standard part by its dimensions, by what it's made of, by its material properties. Think of a design engineer. I need a bolt. I need a bolt that is going to secure a wing to a fuselage is very different from a bolt that's going to be in a seat that's on the airplane. So, I want to find something that's going to withstand the tolerances I need it to withstand. And that can be very challenging today when you're searching a bunch of PDFs, because the data is locked up in there and you can't search by that information. And there's a lot of benefits to this, which are outlined below. But we found that there were a lot of challenges to extracting this information. But it wasn't a completely lost cause. We do have a foundation. We just need to look better at how we get there. And we have a lot of lessons learned. And I talk about those lessons learned in multiple conferences and wherever I get. It's hard to identify certain pieces of information. I have requirements here as an example, because a lot of people think of requirements when they think of standards. But how do I identify a requirement? You could say, well, it's supposed to be in a shall statement, but they aren't always in shall statements. And it's hard to identify what is a requirement versus some other type of information that can be in a standard. It's also going to be challenging whenever we get to other types of information. Whereas we try to identify requirements with shall statements, how do you identify a manufacturing process? How do you identify a test procedure? We don't always have keywords or easy ways for artificial intelligence based large language models, for example, to identify those types of information. We also found it's very hard to normalize the data. Chris talked about all the part standards they have. SAE has a lot of part standards also. These have been, some of these part standards are so old, they're older than I am. And they, people have been doing these 2D drawings and CAD models for years for these standard parts, but they aren't using the same variables for the various dimensions. They are, to look at the material properties across, they're all defined differently. There's a lot of inconsistency there because no one was really thinking, oh, this needs to go into a digital system one day where everything is normalized. So there's a lot of inconsistency and disparate information in these standards. There's a lot of things. I have an example here of list handling, but how do we handle various pieces, various components of a document? So think of a bulleted list or a numbered list. How do I handle that? Do I keep it all as one thing, so I have the sentence before it and all the items beneath it? Do I create a requirement or a separate entity out of each bullet, merging the beginning, the intro, and each bullet? There's a lot of different ways to handle that, and how teaching a machine how to handle those different type of lists, because it's not always consistent how you want to handle those lists. And then classifying information. We are going to have to think about what different types of information people are going to need from standards. And we're going to have to standardize that so that when I'm pulling something that I call a test procedure, that some other standards development organization is pulling the same type of information to call a test procedure. So here's the challenge. Standards development organizations are traditionally publishers. We publish documents and books and journals and various types of things, but it's all some kind of document. So it's a huge change for us to start trying to meet your needs for digital transformation. We have, many of the standards development organizations have offered standards in XML, but the XML schemas that are used today are really more document-centric schemas. They are to show, how should this be formatted? How should this table look? How many columns should it have? How many rows does it have? But if I want to access a data point in that table or understand what does that number represent, those schemas aren't going to help me at all. So they don't help with data transfer and data interoperability. They really are more like a glorified HTML just used for formatting. I go to conferences like this and I'm hearing SysML, I'm hearing RecIF, I'm hearing these terms, but you talk to a lot of standards authors and some people at some standards development organizations, and they have no idea what you're talking about. I held a meeting the other day. Well, actually it was several months ago, where I had the committee meet these people who wanted to create a SysML model of their standard, and they were so confused. They were like, what's SysML? You know, I thought this was going to be a demonstration of how you're going to show our standard in XML. They had no idea what was going on. So there's a lot of education that needs to happen amongst people who write standards and publish standards to understand the digital formats people are looking for. And as Phil was talking about earlier, data interoperability is critical. And I agree with her that it's from a data exchange perspective. We need to start thinking of standards as almost a database of information. And what information does it have? How does it need to be used? And how can we test against it? And they need to be consumable by the major product lifecycle management systems. In the future, I don't see you searching for standards using some general search, like you're searching for a document. I see a standards library within the Dassault ecosystem, within the Siemens ecosystem, where you can pull standards and information from standards directly into your projects that you're doing with those systems. So that's really what brought about the Digital Standards Alliance. I feel like there are so many consortia and groups out there talking about the broader digital transformation, digital engineering, and that's wonderful. But standards are a major building block of that. And I feel like that is not being discussed in a lot of these organizations and these consortia. So we actually contracted our sister company, SAE-ITC, which is Industry Technology Consortia, and we asked them to spin up this consortia. And AIA has joined. We have Lockheed Martin and Boeing and some others have expressed interest. We are trying to get together a forum that's made up of people who write standards, people who use standards to create products, and people who publish standards, and really focus in on what is a digital standard, because it's not going to be just one thing. There's a lot of variability in the types of standards and the types of information and data that they contain. And I think it will be important for us to look at what is the best digital representation of different standards, and how do we align on that so that there isn't an SAE solution and an ASTM solution and an ISO solution and so forth, that we have interoperability. So what are we going to focus on as part of the DSA? So we're going to look at how do we integrate standards data into the tools that people are using every day. We're going to be focusing on best practices in education and setting up a liaison with other digital initiatives. So I'll touch on each of these briefly. How are we going to get from PDF to the various formats that are out there? I've heard SysML, I've heard RecIF, I've heard QIF, and I've heard, I don't know, about 20 or so other formats. So we need to think about what is the best way to digitally represent certain types of standards? And that's a big component of what the DSA will be looking at. But there's also a lot to say around best practices in education. We're going to have to change how we write standards. I'm very passionate about this and talk about this a lot. We are going to have to start thinking about how we are not writing a document, but we are compiling data that's going to be represented digitally. And that's going to change how we write standards. Today, we need to think about consistency. We need to think about how is this going to be interpreted by a machine. It may require a lot more specificity by some of our authors than we have in the past. We also need to think about how are we going to consistently map information from standards to the target schemas and formats we're looking at. Let's take SysML. How is information from a standard, the different types of information, going to map to an activity or map to a use case or map to some other digital representation in SysML? We're going to need to develop standard ways to do that, or there's going to be a lot of inconsistency. I've talked to some people who have modeled standard, and they've basically just taken the standard verbatim, thrown it into Cameo Magic Draw. You can see the table of contents there. But how useful is that? It's really in how you pull that information into your active models is what we need to look at, and the best ways to do that. And how is value best realized from digital standards? We're working on ROI calculations and so forth, because there's going to be investment to this. This is not going to be an inexpensive endeavor, not for the standards development organizations or for industry and government. So, we need to show how can we see the ROI of this. And then finally, we're really looking to liaison with other digital initiatives. I've been going to the digital material management meetings and keeping track of what's going on there. Those have been great, led by Phil and Kyle. Digital Twin Consortium is another one. I recently spoke at the Aerospace and Defense PLM Action Group and talking to them. The Air Force also has a drive consortium and so forth. So we're looking to talk with other organizations and kind of carve out that we really want our focus to be really on standards and how to get standards into the digital ecosystem we're looking to do. So I'm hoping that you'll join us. We want other companies. We want if you're involved in writing, using or publishing standards, we want you to join us, either as a voting member or as a participant. Either way, we're just looking for more people to join this effort and really focus on this part. And that is my last slide.
I think we have some time. Do we have any questions for the panel? Anyone?
So, Ted Mars supporting the NRO. We've heard about composability and standards and interoperability as a critical item. And one of the things I think that's going to be really important, two things that I think are going to be really important are representing and understanding what the validity space of a standard is, because if you don't know what the validity space is, you don't know how to compose it and whether your composition is valid. And then the other one going on with that, getting into digital standards and digital engineering and representing things. So UAF has the standards taxonomy area of the model, which is good kind of at the citation level and can be attached. You can attach standards to other model elements. I think it is short of actual need because it's good for representing the relationship, but doesn't do much to aid the modeler in figuring out what is relevant and valid. And the other part would be, what about intellectual property as we go into digital standards, and how the heck does copyright apply? And would like your views on some of that.
There you go.
Okay, I can start speaking to that. So I'll be quite honest. A lot of the standards development organizations are terrified of the impact to copyright, but I do think that there are ways around that. I think that today people have a false sense of security that copyright is protected in a PDF. But the reality is I can take a PDF of a standard and I can make 5,000 copies and distribute it to my 5,000 friends or start passing them out on the street. Like there is an honor system today, I think, that's related to copyright. And I think that that's still going to apply with digital standards. So, so I keep telling people to keep in mind that yes, we're still going to need agreements in place. We're still going to need to set rules and so forth, but we're going to have limited control over whether we can really, how much we can enforce those rules. In some ways, I think a digital environment, it might make it a little bit easier. In some ways, it's going to be harder. But I do think to also speak to your earlier point, about the validity of standards. I do think when we have standards in a digital format, it is going to make them more searchable and able to uncover more information about those standards. You can figure out what is relevant to what you need. So if you guys want to speak to it.
Just some general comments about the copyright question. I mean, I agree. SDOs are looking at digital rights management already as a way to protect copyright in this evolving world. I will agree with Leslie that copyright is under a lot of pressure, particularly for standards that are incorporated by reference in the U.S. into regulations or law, because there are a lot of court cases out there right now which claim that copyright is lost once the standard is referenced in a regulation. So we're already looking at a world where copyright protection is changing. But sort of building on that, I had a related question, I think, which is that either Leslie or both Leslie and Chris see the standards deliverables changing. I don't necessarily see that every PDF would automatically, morph into a digital standard, but perhaps some earlier than others. And would you consider a digital standard offering, which is not going to be a direct transcription of the table of contents and the introduction and such, but something of a different document, a different offering? Is that a value added product? You would still have the PDF and you'd have something else as well.
That's what we're looking at SAE, is offering it in addition to the PDF. One of the things that, there is a lot more value that you can get from that. And I lost my train of thought. I was going to say something about what you had said, and I lost my train of thought. If you want to talk to Chris, I might remember.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there's definitely an element for standards developers where there is a business model there, right? So even if a standard is offered for free, right? Everybody would love free, but the standard is never free, right? It costs somebody something to produce it. It's just a different business model, right? So in some situations, some standards developers do offer their standards at no cost to the users, but the cost is borne by the people who funded the effort, right? So I think somewhere in there is the right mix of making sure that the organizations that take on the responsibility of managing that content have a way to continue to operate. Because one of the things that we want to make sure that, and then also as the method by which we're delivering content changes from PDF to something, maybe a model instead. I think that's one of the things we're going to be looking at in the Digital Standards Alliance is what does that look like? And how do you make sure that there are, yes, there is an honor system that's kind of inherent throughout, right? People can always cheat, but looking at that model and how to make sure that there is, and again, it's not about making money. It's about making sure that we stay viable as an organization, right? And so, anyway, I don't know if you...
I did remember. So when SAE first started creating digital standards, our perspective was that the digital standard would match the PDF verbatim. And we didn't include the committees because we were just creating a digital version verbatim. And that's part of why it wasn't successful, is because it can't be exactly verbatim. It does need to have the same meaning and be interpreted the same as the PDF. But it would be like if you're taking a sentence and you're going to take a sentence from French to English. Or English to French. What if I translate every individual word to French and then try to string it together in a sentence? It's not going to make sense. So I had to go back to our council. We have a council over the airspace and the automotive standards and say to them, you know what, they can't be the same verbatim, and we have to include the committees. And this is something we are going to have to expose people who are writing the standards to, so that they can validate that these digital artifacts that we create are correct. So it is going to add to the process, but it is going to create much more meaningful and valuable artifacts that people will be able to use.
If I can just piggyback on that for a second, I think part of the change in mindset really is going to have to happen from the very beginning, from when the standards developers are creating content, right? Because right now, I'm working, our fastener committee has people who've been in the industry for 40 years. And they remember the days when we were mailing ballots, hard copy, right? Okay, so now anything that I create that's digital is a derivative of the source document, which was based on a paper document that 15 years ago we scanned in, did an OCR, and now we have a digital version of it. But we need to move from that to actually, and part of the challenge is, how do you move somebody who's used to doing something now in Word into a model, right? And so do they have the tools? How expensive is it? How much are we going to ask our experts to become modelers, right? As opposed to the expert on the dimensions of the part and that kind of thing. So there's some inherent challenges in terms of just getting our experts to the point where they can operate in the environment where your source of truth, your content, is not based on a piece of paper, even if it's a digital piece of paper. So that's one of the challenges that we're going to eventually have to get into. And kind of along the lines of what Leslie's talking about, it's like, what is the actual starting point now? So.
Yeah.
Good morning. Yeah, so that actually, with the DSA discussion, got me kind of fired up. So I'm sorry if this kind of seems all over the place, because I'm having all these different ideas. But one of the themes I'm seeing here is basically having a set of modular standards. And I should probably back up a bit. I'm Ryan Whitaker. I'm with DIA. I work in the CDO section. I come from like a software development background. And now they got me kind of trying to map out policies and standards, mostly with regards to, metadata right now. And so as I parse through all these documents, what really resonates with me is the fact that they're documents, and PDFs are and Word documents are just inherently, I think, bad for trying to interpret standards into something that a machine can understand. Obviously, you talked about XML schemas, and within the IC we're using, like certain defined XML standards for that, but within documents, yes, there's a lot of limitations. And so I think, systems are basically just a set of business processes that you can capture. And I think as we move towards having more modular standards you can plug together, there's going to be a lot of friction, especially with these different legacy systems that the DoD has that are inherently monolithic. As we move towards, again, more robust metadata capturing, more robust, like ABAC, permission security controls, and capturing exactly what those policies are within that system, you're going to have to basically re-architect everything. And going back to what is it called? Digital modernization or digital transformation. That's like an eternal struggle. I think a lot of senior leaders don't really grasp is that it's never going to end. And so I guess really what I'm trying to get at is there anything with regards to taking those high-level standards. So if you talk maybe from like an acquisition standpoint, you start there. And I don't know if people here follow DODI 5000.87. I know we don't. But it provides a very robust framework for capturing those requirements. And then each of those requirements has a set of standards you can correlate it with potentially. And from that, you could, I'm sure everybody's aware of DISISTIGs. From that, you could correlate those requirements with maybe specific, baseline functional capabilities, which you can then correlate with, what controls do those need to have. And possibly we can execute this by maybe following some sort of like standard ontology, like a high level ontology that defines these different substandards. And then we could maybe on a more technical scale reference each of these with objects or something like that. So are we talking about how to make different standards interoperate from high levels to low levels, possibly using ontologies, possibly using something else? Are any discussions like that happening right now? Or are we still kind of just trying to define like what those meta standards are, I guess?
So I wasn't going to bring up the O word, but yes. That's part of what we're going to try to do with the DSA is really define ontologies that apply to different types of standards. I think it's going to be critical as we look at the interoperability that needs to happen at the data exchange level.
How are we doing on time, Michael? 10 minutes. Okay. Rich.
Can you hear me all right? Okay, thank you. Rich Forselius, Lockheed Martin, representing the aerospace and defense contractor community. First of all, I want to thank Chris for mentioning the urgency of participation. This is key. Everyone in this room, everyone online, we need you all to be missionaries. We need you to assist here relative to U.S. interests and engagement because we're not seeing enough of that across the board. And also, I want to say there's a little bit of fresh air in this, in that the perception is emerging professionals are with the program. They work in a digital world already. It's some of us who are senior here, who are so used to PDF and what have you, where there's more challenge. And I also see the DSA as a place to start to achieve consensus across industry, SDOs, and government. In AIA, I wrote, with the help of others, something called the Future of Aerospace Standardization. And one of the challenges cited there is there's no entity we can go to that it can help us collaborate on all our efforts. And I see the DSA is helping here. However, this has got to be accelerated. I hate to see everyone referring to this in the future tense. This is now, and some SDOs are ahead and some are woefully behind. And we must demand this. It's urgent, it's inevitable, and we have to recognize the voice of the customer in this. What is the government demanding? What are your airframers and other systems providers demanding? Where is the ROI value? I know that was mentioned already, the efficiency gained and what have you. And we're all focused exactly on the digital twin. And the elements of that through digital transformation include the digital thread, virtual simulation, and to feed directly into our tools. The vision here is it affects all elements of our manufacture, our design and manufacture, from our supply chain to design to development to manufacturing to sustainment. And the differences have to be understood on what's machine readable versus what is human understandable. So my question to the panel is, what's the vision? Fast forward 20 years, what does the landscape look like here? What do we hope to achieve? Thank you.
Right, me for sure. You guys are the visionaries. So 20, yeah, Rich, 20 years from now, things will be dramatically different. And some of this conversation reminds me of a conversation I was part of about probably 10 years ago when I was still at NIST, when we first started talking about what was called then cyber physical systems, and brought a whole new set of folks into the conversation that hadn't previously been in the conversation. And although they were all engineers, they were all talking past one another, different languages, the communications were very different versus if you're, if it's a smart city, if you're anything that's, connected to the network versus a freestanding piece of infrastructure. So we will get there. Some of it is ontology. Some of it is more discussions like this. So you share these different perspectives. The standards landscape is going to look dramatically different probably 10 years from now, leave aside 20 years from now, but not the entire standards landscape. The one we're talking about, where the forward-leaning, digital twin, digital representation, digital everything's connected, will be dramatically different. But there are subsets of the standards ecosystem that will still remain, paper-based, and so you have to leave room for all of this. But I think it's important to the one point you made. There isn't any top-down direction coming from this in the U.S. because we don't have a top-down system. It's going to come from the stakeholders. So you have to go to the table and advise the standards developing organizations who want to be very forward-leaning why this is important, and also put resources behind that.
So a couple quick response to Rich. So I've been at AIA for 15 years. One of the first things that we started talking about when I was there, and it was probably 10 years before I got there, standards as digital data. And here we're 15 years after that point, and we're still talking about standards as digital data, right? So having lived through that now at this point, I'm very hopeful. I think a couple things are happening. One is that folks that maybe of a more emerging or younger generation are going to say, what are we doing? Like, this is crazy, right? So I think there, just some of the generational expectations and changes will hopefully push that. But I also think that some of the things that we're doing with the Digital Standards Alliance, I'm hopeful that will help. There needs to be some protection of some proprietary work that companies are doing, but there's also common elements that we have to define and agree that, hey, what is the minimum that I need to define to deliver content, right? So what I need to be able to do is say, okay, to my management, this is what it looks like. This is how much it's going to cost. This is how long it's going to take. We have to start now. I can't do that right now because I don't have clarity on where we're going. And so once I have that clarity, I'm hopeful we can move quickly. And then what I need on the other end is somebody who goes, oh yeah, that's exactly what we're looking for. And hopefully those 2 points will meet at the same time. We were talking earlier with Leslie before this, and she said, you can't just snap your fingers and have this happen tomorrow. Like, there has to be work to define, prepare, develop. So hopefully we will take something that we talked about 15 years ago, and in the next 5 will be a dramatically different space. So
I think one thing to also add on to that is that I think things are changing so rapidly today. Just think 5 years ago it was so different, and it's going to be even more different 5 years from now. And even though the talk about digital standards has been going on for over 10 years, I feel that it's a different environment today, because now it's not just a matter of competition against other standards development organizations, or however you want to talk about it. It's trying not to be obsolete. We have to meet this, and if we don't meet it, we are going to be left behind, because the technology's out there for organizations to do this with or without us. So I think it's a very different environment. So I see things moving fairly rapidly.
Hi, thanks. Richard Ott with Abbott Dice. So I'm actually very happy to hear that you had mentioned that. I was hoping someone would mention that word, obsolete. The other thing that I think has been discussed, but not necessarily directly addressed, is the idea of the end state. You talked about needing to get to it and figure out how to do it. I guess in my mind, if we all start working toward an ideal end state, right, maybe that helps push people in the same direction. So it's more of a comment here, I guess, than a question, but I think I would encourage you to think through the fact that standards exist to provide quality or security for a consumer or for a use case. The way that that's done is through compliance. So maybe that ideal end state is to look at it as an automated compliance. Then that maybe drives the question of how you actually develop the standard digitally or in whatever format to be able to show how it's used. So maybe kind of start at the end and work back, but happy to talk afterwards. Thanks.
Chris, you got a.
So a couple of quick questions. Are we going to be getting all the briefing slides later? Okay. And I can't wait to share. I'm trying to straighten out a whole lot of things. God willing, work willing, well, health willing, I'm going to retire in 5 or 6 years. And there's a whole lot of stuff in my whole career that never got right. And I'm trying to get it right down in Orlando. So the SAE slides are really great. I'm trying to respect copyrights. Leslie, all your slides say not to be used any further than right there on those slides without further permission. Am I allowed to shove those at some meaningful people at my organization?
Yeah, you can go ahead and show those. I don't think there's anything really on there. I just use our template. That
I don't think so either. I'm beating up on templates now that for official use only is no longer the thing. I just had a briefing because I signed up to be a data transfer agent to copy CDs because I need to. I do tech drawings and drawing reviews. And I asked the guy after his hour-long class, I said, are these slides current? He said, yes. I said, then why does it say FOUO instead of CUI? We got rid of that like 2.5, 3 years ago.
And I think, we got one more, Chris.
There it goes. I have a practical question. So we all talk about we're a consensus, standards organization. If you replace the paper or the PDFs with a model, how do all the reviewers get to the model so that they can understand what's in the model and provide comments back?
Yeah, that is exactly what I was referring to, right? How do you help your experts who may not be experts at whatever tool we're talking about? So I don't have right now they're looking at PDF files to do the approvals, right? But the future state is going to be something different, and figuring out how to make that easy for and in order for it to work, it can't be something that is going to be a tool that we're going to have to provide some way for them to be able to access the information. So exactly what that looks like, I don't know, but Leslie may.
I think just like today, we have various systems for committees to collaborate, that we're going to need to set up that kind of ecosystem for digital standards as well. One example comes to mind that you can look at. It's called MT Connect. You can access it on the web. If you search for MT Connect, it'll come out. I think it's really the first truly digital standard. It's in a SysML model. It's out there for anyone to look at how it's organized, and I think that the model has become so strongly used and so adopted that I don't think they're even going to publish a PDF of that standard in the future. And it's based off of an ANSI standard. And I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the number of the ANSI standard, but if you search for it, you can find it. But that's one example. It's out there for anyone to give comments or to review. But that's also, I think, a more open standard. So I think we'll be able to do that in a closed environment for the people who are directly involved with the committee as well. I think the bigger issue is what Chris pointed to, is that, you know, most committees you go to and talk to, they have no idea what SysML is, or how to read SysML, or how to validate that a model is an accurate representation of what they wrote as a Word document. There's a big gap right now between people who are experts in standards and people who are experts in MBSE. And I think bridging that gap is going to be a huge challenge, because MBSE is a whole it's a whole discipline. It's a whole different way of thinking. You know, not everyone who's writing standards has that systems engineering mindset, or is going to really understand the best way to represent their standard as a model. So when we do talk, and I'm not saying every standard is going to be a SysML model. I think there's going to be different types of digital artifacts for different types of standards. But I do think that's definitely been a focus of the DoD for several standards to be as a SysML model.
Okay, thank you. So that is a committee perspective, which is great. I'm also interested in DSPO and what their perspective is on that, as we try to do assist coordinations using a model instead of a document.
So of course, all the same considerations apply. Part of what we're working on in the next year is a digital standard strategy that's going to lay out our approach to solving these problems. I don't have an easy button answer.
Okay.
But one of the principles that we're laying out a few principles right up front in the strategy. We need to continue to use the consensus-based standards principles Mary mentioned within the non-government standards bodies. We apply those same principles within the DoD to a maybe more limited extent, but they still apply to all of the documents that we reproduce. As we move from documents to digital products, we still need to go through those same processes. The end product will need to be tool agnostic, so we don't get locked into one vendor or another. It's what part of what drove us to initially looking at XML conversion, because XML is so ubiquitous. But as we look at other formats, other uses, those things that you mentioned are constraints, right? The tool has to be available. The product has to be readable by the committee, by the coordinating activities, the review activities. So I don't have a full answer for you today. We recognize the challenges, and really looking forward to working together with other standards development organizations to solve these problems together.
All right, thank you.
And please join me in giving a round for our panelists: Mary Saunders-Yancey, Chris Carnahan, AIA, and Leslie McKay, SAE.
All right, and we're on break. Please be back in your seats at 10. Thank you.